And switch. All right, go ahead and do your intro. Go ahead and have a seat, Shane. So he's going to be doing a lecture.
It just came.
That's fine. That's great. Awesome.
So
He's going to be doing a lecture. The slides are not working, so it's going to be all verbal. So you'll want to take notes as best you can.
Yep.
There is a verbal quiz at the end.
Okay.
On random stuff that I will make up in my head.
Well, related to the lecture.
Oh, you take all the fun out of it.
So everybody have a seat.
Dang it. Should have gone to John's table to get used to this.
What?
I can't. You know.
It's a different login.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we had that issue the other day.
Okay.
These are all. Any one of those that is not.
Well,
Oh, that's an old D&D. Good evening. As you can see, we're already broadcasting.
Full
We're not on
introduction,
camera.
Introduce
on
who we
camera.
are and all that.
There you go. There you go. Good evening. My name is John Welker. I'm the Vice President of RPG Research. RPG Research is a 501c3 nonprofit organization who studies the effects of role-playing games in all formats, including tabletop, solo adventure books and modules, live-action role-playing games, and electronic role-playing games. We'll get into more details of those in just a moment. We also utilize our findings for community programs, such as the drop-in and RPG sessions that we do every Friday. This Friday will be at a random location in Hilliard. Go to RPG.
Empire and Market in Hilliard.
The corner of Empire and Market in Hilliard. Tomorrow, Friday, at 4 o'clock is when we'll start the fun. You can find out more information about that at our drop-in and RPG.com. Now, today we're going to do a lecture. It normally is done with a slideshow with nice videos and music and all the flashes pizzazz. But Murphy's Law is that if it doesn't go wrong, you haven't started. So we're going to go ahead and do the lecture strictly verbal and hope everybody can keep up.
I thought Murphy's Law was if it can go wrong, it will.
Right, and which means that if it hasn't gone wrong, you haven't started anything yet. I extrapolated. It's a mathematical process where you know the outcome, but you see what it would be if you pushed it a little bit further. All right, so today's class is RPG-99. This course will be available at rpg.education, and it will be a paid-for class. So if you're catching this now live, you are getting a freebie. This is also just a practice session for myself to practice giving the class for the live ones that I would be doing later for paid clients. So, if, like I said, if you're watching it now, count yourself lucky. You're going to get some information. Some knowledge will be dropped. Now, excuse me. Before we begin the class, we'll talk about optimizing the learning process. Section provides very high-level summary of the cognitive neuroscience best practice considerations taken into account in development the online versions of these courses. All of these topics are actually relevant to role-playing games in various ways. This is fairly technical information, and there is an entire course just on these concepts. But for now, just try to get a basic understanding of these topics. They are on the quiz because it's so important for really getting the most from learning experience here. If you want to learn more about these topics in depth, watch the Cognitive Neuroscience of Learning for a Layperson's course available later. The best practices maximum transference use using layperson technology, short-term memory, STM, and long-term memory, LTM, includes consideration of the following.
So first thing I'm going to say, because this happens every time, and it's normal. Slow down. Reading from it.
Right.
Slow down the pacing, and so you kind of try to read. I'm not going to be able to come in and keep helping you, but you sit down.
Right. You sit down.
Yeah,
I will mumble.
But just keep it nice and slow, so that you can Work on the pronunciation. It's better that you're slow and clear
And enunciate
than
properly.
fast and mumbled. Yeah.
All right.
Remember your theater background.
Glory be unto thee. Okay. We're not going to talk about Caesar today. Of course, my throat is completely fine until the moment I start talking for the broadcast. Isn't that wonderful?
Always.
Yeah.
We have some water here if you want. Just.
I have my RPG Research branded cup. That if you had joined us a couple Christmases ago, you would have gotten one.
But I hadn't known.
Yeah, the only problem really is that the company that made these for me went out of business.
Yeah.
I can't get more. At least not from that company. All right. So, in order to maximize your learning potential, we want to reduce the risk of various interference factors which hinder excessive noise, music, television, playing a video game. You know, anything that can distract you from what you're doing. This is probably not a course you should take while driving. Avoid divided attention situations which hinder. Again, they're the same interference factors. Deep level processing helps. Elaboration helps. Distinctiveness helps. So elaboration is getting into more detail and more clarification of things. For example, that's how elaboration works. Distinctiveness is how do you make it stick out in your mind? You form that nice picture. Relating to prior knowledge, existing knowledge helps. This is like that. If you know what a camel is, you know that alpacas are like camels. That kind of thing. Reinforce interconnections of concepts help. Distributed practice differential learning helps. Learning things in different methods. See it, hear it, say it. Yeah. Avoid mass learning, aka cramming, which hinders. Take into account cognitive chunking limitations. Does anybody know how many pieces of data we're able to process at a time? Just a random number based on dice.
No.
No.
I thought it's
Chunking.
20 per day or something.
When you're trying to present something to you, 5 to 7 pieces of data at a time. In the chunking. When you have large sets of numbers, don't try to remember the all 17 digits. Break it down into little pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Accuracy and self-assessment of competency areas. If you don't know it, admit you don't know it. Helps get deeper into that. Getting enough sleep makes a significant difference. I don't know about that one. I never get that.
You never get to practice that one.
Yeah, practice the sleeping stuff. Substance use impairment considerations. Don't do drugs. Limitations of duration of focus and cognitive fatigue. Mental imagery helps, but keep in mind some people have aphantasia. Anybody know what aphantasia is?
It's where you basically can't. You have to have it physically in front of you. You can't imagine it.
Right. You can't form those pictures in your head to see that. And there's a certain group of people that can't do that. So when you're doing things purely descriptive, they can't see what you're talking about in their head. They need to see pictures. They need to have physical minis and maps and things like that help out for those people. Encoding clues help. Retrieval cues help. These are the things that help key mnemonics. Mnemonics, if I'm saying that right? Help key those memories.
Do you mean now you've got me saying it differently.
Yeah,
Numerics.
not that's numbers.
It's the one where you like Sally.
Yes.
Yeah, acronyms.
Acronyms, memory tools,
Yeah.
associating A with B, So when you talk about Joe Horseman, you think of a horseman. Motivating topics help some, but not much as many thought. The key is the type of motivations, intrinsic versus extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is yourself. Intrinsic motivation does help, while research also shows that extrinsic motivation does not significantly help. However, those with disorders like ADHD can find such external motivators helpful if they are positive or negative reinforcements in general, while positive or negative punishments are not generally effective in general. Again, intrinsic is self-motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And
Excuse me, John.
yes.
I missed one of the concepts. You mentioned elaboration, distinctiveness, and a third one.
Reinforce interconnection of concepts.
Oh, that's the third one?
Elaboration helps, distinctives helps, relating to prior knowledge, existing knowledge helps.
All right, thank you.
Interesting topics help. It does help if you're actually interested in learning the topic. Narrative techniques, very helpful. Associative knowledge, very helpful. Self-reference effect, extremely helpful. Desirable difficulties, very helpful. The testing effects helps. Taking quizzes shortly thereafter and then taking a final test later. Exploration of opportunities, very helpful. Interactive opportunities for learning are very helpful. Actually doing something that you're doing. The Army method of teaching is see one, do one, teach one. You don't really master something until you're able to teach somebody else with it.
And that goes back to the concept that you first touched on with the see it, say it, do it.
Mm-hmm. The introductory courses do not implement solutions to all of the above issues, but do attempt to address the most critical. The immediate and advanced courses do try to address all the above issues through much more hands-on interactive activities. Fortunately, we're going mostly to lecture, which is the least effective. No, we're doing all lecture right now. So that's the least effective method of teaching people, but it is what we have available with our cognitive. It's better if we show you pictures and things to associate things with.
It's very interesting. The least effective
is the most common?
is the most commonly used
because it's the most efficient for a person to stand up and just talk than it is for a person to get up and say, "Okay, let's all gather around and do something."
Plus, some people get a power trip on.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the main course, but it
No,
does.
I don't think most people do that, but I think some people that's what they, because you have to listen to me because I have the information that you.
Mm-hmm.
So limit your study time to about 45 minutes at a time. Take 5 to 15-minute break between each study session. Spread your learning over several days. Do not try to cram. Be honest on the quizzes. In other words, don't just sit there and take a pile of notes and then use those to answer your quiz. Actually, try to see what you learned.
What do you mean wondering?
Now, with the quiz that we'll be taking online when everything is done up there, you have to get 100% on your quizzes before you can move on. You won't have to get that high of a score on the final exam, which takes all the quizzes into account, but you will need a high score, and I believe it's 90% in order to pass the course. 80? You're allowed 20%? We'll see.
It says it in the notes.
Get enough sleep and sufficient exercise. These are huge impact on learning, input, retention, and recall, which is learning is input, retention is storage, and recall is output process. Fully complete all of the assignments. They're there to help add further elaboration of the knowledge for better retention. At this point, you've probably been at the course around 45 minutes still, so it's time for a break. But this didn't take me 45 minutes to read all that to you, did it? So, What are your questions about those notes there? There will be some quizzing on that. I may ask you just one question on that because that's literally just a laundry list of ideas.
I mean, well, it all makes pretty, all pretty common sense stuff, even though a lot of people do it. Trying to blast everything in at the last minute, right? Before you test.
Right.
If you don't already know it, beating yourself up the night before is really not good.
Plus the fact that you're going to show up the next day exhausted.
Oh yeah.
I haven't slept because I've been so busy studying. And one of the other things that cramming does is it leads to learn, recite, dump.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the information crammed in your head, you spill it out on your test, and now you don't know anything that you just talked about.
Which is not.
Definitely how I got through the classes in college.
And now you need them.
No.
So we're talking about role-playing games. There'll be a specific definition of what a role-playing game is, and we're going to talk about the history of role-playing games as we do it. We'll start with the prehistory of things that started. The 20-sided dice that is used in Dungeons and Dragons and many role-playing games has been around since Egypt, ancient Egypt. Egypt is still around, so that it's not actually a good time frame. But it was not being used for role-playing games at the time that we're aware of, because role-playing games weren't invented yet. Very brief summary of the history of role-playing games. A historical context is important for being prepared for any potential pushback that sometimes occur because of many inculcated concepts regarding role-playing, gaming, and gamers. Inculcated, everybody's learned this. Yeah, the word that I can't say. Say it again.
Inculcated.
Inculcated. INCULCATED. Even as recently as 2019, we have run into many settings and people who still believe that the inculcated negative stereotypes and myths about role-playing games and gamers outside the geek culture bubble. The majority of people need to be educated about the myths and reality of role-playing games. So what he means by outside of our own bubble, those of us who are in gaming find everything normal and think that everybody thinks like we do, when most people out there, if you look at the studies of what people are watching on TV, aren't fantasy fans. They're procedural fans, medical procedural, police procedural, things like that. Grey's Anatomy just became the longest running medical procedural show in history. Just recently beating out ER by one episode. So the next episode will be even further, but
however, they are not the longest medical. Goes to
General Hospital is not a medical drama. General Hospital is a soap opera that happens to occur near a hospital, in and around a hospital.
Whatever.
It is not a procedural by any.
Whatever.
Yeah, the people's illnesses and diseases and injuries that will happen in General Hospital sometimes are occurring to aliens and ghosts. That is not a procedural. Yes, I used to watch General Hospital, and I have seen the aliens and the ghosts.
They do mess up anything that they do internally, but it's very close. All the medical terminology is very correct, and the drugs that are equal to the thing.
You're paying way too much attention to the drugs being used on a soap opera.
Not medical. Not the soap opera.
Oh, Grey's Anatomy.
Yes.
Okay, Grey's Anatomy is
They do mess up a lot of the stuff that they internally do in the body, but other than that, they're really good. As far as all the other correctness. And now we're off on a tangent.
Which I'm throwing us back out of. We literally have to spend a considerable amount of time every time we approach new clients outside of the fandom, addressing the concerns that role-playing games, Dungeons & Dragons, are dangerous or inherently evil. This is a very significant issue in 2019. Examples in just 2018 and 2019 include presentations at public school districts, rehabilitation centers, hospitals, and modern-day orphanages. and much of the general public outside the fandom bubble. We've literally been told, not while I'm living, will we bring role-playing games into this facility. We've literally had people say, aren't these things dangerous at a presentation of modern people? We often run into those in geek culture community who do not understand why we still waste time addressing these issues. We found that if we do not address them head on upfront, that prospective clients will not be able to listen to the rest of the information. There's literally a difference between getting the contract and not getting the contract. What has happened before is when we've given speeches and we try to skip the history and answer all the questions, all the people are doing while they're going through the lecture is going, but what about the violence? Until they get to the end, and that's all they want to ask, and they didn't hear anything else because they're currently working on that.
And then we've had other ones where they may be slightly open-minded, but they still wanted to know, even if it was the second one in the series, why it isn't dangerous. Not necessarily, oh, it can't be. But why isn't it dangerous? You guys are talking about like it's something that I absolutely need to use. Why isn't?
Right. So, RPG prehistory from the dawn of the early ages, wargamings before 1913. Before RPGs, the early roots, we had war games prior to 1913, and war games from 1913 to 1971. Wargaming is the simulation of combat strategies and tactics representing in reduced scale the various rules for action resolution. As long as there's been organized warfare, there appears to have been some form of wargaming in every culture through history. Now, chess and Go are related to military tactical thinking, but are not actual wargaming. Wargaming includes considerations for factors such as terrain. On a Go board, there is no terrain, it's just lines and dots. Weather, and nobody's ever had the queen struck by lightning before in a game of chess. And randomization, there's no randomization in either one of those games. You move your piece, they move their piece. Both people are strategy knowing things, but there's nothing like, oh, I move my pawn to the queen, I roll a dice and the pawn beats the queen, or the queen beats the. You don't know the outcome until the dice tell you.
Does anyone know what board game was 1913?
What board game?
War game was produced in 1913.
Wars.
Little Wars. Yes.
Little Wars, yes. So if we're doing the slides, I would be showing you a picture of the autumn maneuvers, which was officers playing at Kriegsspiel, which is the game of war, and that was in a magazine called The Graphic, August 17th, 1872. There is a variant called live action wargaming. It's different from standard wargaming and live action role playing. Most live action wargaming is recreation. Sometimes they're what if scenarios, but they are not the same as live action role playing games.
What was the title of that was in the graphic? I'm sorry.
The graphic that you couldn't see?
In the graphic magazine, what was the thing that was published?
Kriegsspiel.
Kriegs, next word Spiel.
IEL?
IEL. Spiel.
Okay.
The picture's called The Autumn Maneuvers.
War games were common even before them in the noble courts as part of military training, weren't they?
Yes. So the fact that in a medieval country they would have games of, figuring out different tactics and things like that and playing with that. But as far as
Published?
Right, that's the first published war game that was open to the masses as opposed to just the rich. Not until the late 1890s and early 1900s did the middle class start developing and people had free time, let alone the money for leisure sports like wargaming. H.G. Wells, author of such science fiction novels as The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Monroe, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. Wells revolutionized wargaming with his publications of the small book called Little Wars. This was in 1913. This, we have a copy of it over here somewhere. But this talks about exceptional girls being played, about being able to play war games. I think it's up on this part of the shelf somewhere. It could be anywhere. I'm not going to worry about it right now.
Keep going. I'm looking for it.
There was a picture of H.G. Wells sitting Little Wars on the lawn. They actually had to, their cannons would actually fire projectiles, and you had to hit your target to count. And then you had a lot of measuring stuff, and it was a big space-consuming thing. Because unlike modern wargaming, which has less than 28 millimeter, I can't remember what the scale is, but like this could be a tank. And there are some war games that used pieces of cardboard instead of miniatures. That actually came later. Excluding reenactment and live wargaming, there are still only two main formats for war games: miniature-based war games and board game-based war games. So the pieces of papers and stuff like that. Stratego is a board game war game. At this point in history, there are only two major genres of war game settings: historical and hypothetical. And the hypothetical is, well, what if the French had came in early? Or what if the Russians had joined forces with the Hungarians? It wasn't based on anything more extravagant than what if it was done in a different time, what if the weather was different, etc.
Question. So you said there's only historical and hypothetical, which is basically historical with some alteration, what-if scenarios. But so in that case, would Warhammer Fantasy Battle not be considered a war game? Because its setting is fantasy.
It would have been, it is considered a war game, but it is not considered a war game in the 1900s.
Oh, right, sorry.
So at the time period of the 1900s, 1913, there were only two types. Historical, where they're recreating an actual battle. You're doing the Battle of Waterloo, and you're just playing out exactly what happened. Because of the randomization, there may be a different outcome, but it's you have the same number of troops that were actually available. You have that there's no variance on that kind of stuff. Then you have the hypothetical ones where, well, yeah, what if they had cannons in Custard? What if Custard had brought along cannons? Would that have changed anything? And do not correct me if Custard actually had cannons at Custard's Last Stand. It's not actually relevant to this. All right.
That was a hypothetical in itself.
Yes.
I don't think he did.
Now, science fiction and fantasy genres it was coming up later. Notable authors of the time were Edgar Allan Poe, Edgar Rice Burroughs. Does anyone know what Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote? Tarzan and many other science fiction stories as well. H.G. Wells, as we already mentioned, H.P. Lovecraft, Jules Verne, and many others. Increasingly large percent of the population became interested in these genres. In the 1930s, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, and 13 years later, The Lord of the Rings, hit the literary world and inspired the minds and hearts of generations with a wave of popular cultural enthusiasm. Fantasy wasn't a very popular theme. I mean, there's fairy tales, but nothing as epic as. Also, remember at this time, Beowulf wasn't considered a fantasy, though Gilgamesh is also the first novel ever written. Chainmail came around in 1868 to 1973. This is the fantasy genre influence on wargaming. This was the first 1968 to 1973 chainmail.
Said 18.
Yeah. Now there is an argument, and I'm sure you'll be in my notes too, that Arneson was involved in a Brownstein game which had role-playing elements. But Chainmail was a war game that had fantasy elements, such as Wizards and Dragons.
And it was the official first published.
Well, Chainmail's not even a role-playing game yet.
Okay.
This is just the role-playing game that eventually got developed into Dungeons and Dragons and became a role-playing game. Because it was still wargaming, beginning development of Chainmail in 1968. And was first published in 1971. These were rules for medieval miniatures combat, with a small section in the rear allowing rules to include fantasy creatures and magic, and literally a very small section in the back. Also increasingly led to favorite leaders or small groups engaging in dungeon crawls, which finally evolved into the first role-playing game, which was published in 1974. Now, again, the argument about which is the first role-playing game, we can definitely say that Dungeons & Dragons was the first published role-playing game. Dave Arneson and the Blackmore with the Arnesons, which was done at a convention, was never published, had role-playing aspects to it, and could be say that, hey, yeah, that was a game that had role-playing elements in it, but it wasn't published. So.
Well, it wasn't the first actually an adaptation on Chain.
Dungeons & Dragons was an adaptation of Chainmail.
Yes.
Published in 1974, right?
Correct. Now, Chainmail was written by E. Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. Perrin is P-E-R-E-N. Does everybody know how to spell Gygax? Because I know it's a rough word. G-Y-G-A-X.
Who's the other guy besides Gygax?
Jeff Perrin, P-E-R-E-N. Dave Arneson had not come on board yet. Dave Arneson came in when Dungeons & Dragons was actually, they made it to a actual role-playing game. 1974 is the invention of a new recreational activity. The first officially published role-playing game is Dungeons & Dragons D&D, now retroactively called Original D&D, OD&D.
AD&D.
Well, OD&D is to distinguish that this is the first thing that was ever published. It was the original rule set. AD&D doesn't come until much later. Because before AD&D, well, actually simultaneously, comes basic Dungeons and Dragons. This is Hawk's game, and it's the basic rules for Dungeons and Dragons. This is Arneson's Blackmore. Dungeons and Dragons rules for fantastic medieval war games campaign, playable paper and pencil, and miniature figures. Book 1, Men in Magic. Sure, if I get close enough to the camera so people can see that.
If you wish, I could load it over here while you pass it to.
Well, we just need the first one.
All right.
I mean, I will flash out that there was made up multiple books and expansions. These are not the original covers. They were a lot more salacious.
This one is the publication of Blackmore, which is just Dave.
That was the campaign. So the first campaign was Blackmore.
I do.
Okay. Now, it's retroactively called OD&D to differentiate between the later editions. Right now, we're on what's known as 5th edition, which is actually only 5th edition of the advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules. If you count the basic D&D editions and the OD&D, we're up like around 8. Difference between later editions: simply sample booklets made by hand in the creator's home. Totally, there was initially 3, but eventually a total of 7 books in the first edition of D&D, not to be mistaken for advanced D&D, which is some people call first edition. Initially, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson relied solely on word-of-mouth advertising, but were soon swamped with orders, and within a few years, they were selling millions of copies of D&D-related products. Side note, Gen Con, the oldest gaming convention in the world, was actually created by Gary Gygax prior to Dungeons & Dragons, because he had a wargaming society. The OD&D books include a list of references, influence, and recommended readings. Many of these clearly influenced the initial and later developed the games, some more subtly, and others directly, including the list lengthens. But some of the most notable science fiction, fantasy, poetry, and horror authors include Edgar Allan Poe, Edgar Rice Burroughs, H.G. Wells, H.P. Lovecraft, J.R.R. Tolkien, Michael Moorcock, and Robert E. Howard. These are visible names.
Almost all of the ones that were written influential at the start of the wargaming.
Yep. Debate about the first RPG. A small number of people refute the claim that Dungeons & Dragons is the first role-playing game. Among the variety of claims, one group of people felt strongly enough about the debate that they put in enough effort and found enough support to successfully fund a Kickstarter support movie documentary called Secrets of Blackmoor: The True History of Dungeons & Dragons. A detailed analysis of the claims in the movie are beyond the introduction scope of this course. If interested in a more in-depth, detailed analysis, consider one of the history of RPG-focused courses later. But they talk about the Brownstein game, which introduced role-playing elements, individual characters, people having to do negotiations. The first time they had they didn't have dungeon masters; they had a referee for that game. And the first time they played this game, the referee lost all control, because he wasn't present for everything that was happening. So he'd come back out and find out that, oh, these other people negotiated this and did that. And like, what? What's going on here? Now, the 1980s, where the peak estimate of just D&D players have been around at least 2 to 5 million, which is based on direct sales and does not take into account the large number of players that do not buy books for themselves. The number was about 1 to 5% of the U.S. population, which at the time was 220 million.
And this is the peak of the U.S.
Right. This is the beginning of everything there. When they're talking about the players that know by the book, so an average table has 3 to 5 players plus the dungeon master. Only the dungeon master buys the books. The players might chip in and stuff like that. But, so if you can multiply the number of books sold by 3 to 5 to get a more accurate number, theoretically speaking. Number of tabletop and LARP RPGs is very difficult to calculate, much easier to get numbers for video games due to the more tangible nature. You buy a book, you use it forever. Video games, each person usually has their own. It's difficult to pin down the number of actual RPG players, since it's often just the dungeon master, aka the dungeon master, purchased most of the books, as I already mentioned. 3 to 8 players, mostly borrow books from the GM, and only some would buy their own limited assortment of books. unless they became a GM. This makes it effectively impossible to know the true number of tabletop or lower gamers.
John, just
yes.
a question. When was this peak of about 5%?
That was in the 1980s.
In the 1980s, 1 to 5% of the U.S. population was playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Right, thank you. That's that.
Other,
Notable to say that this is the U.S. because there are peaks.
well, we can call it the Golden Age, and then I will mention the Golden Age for other countries coming up. In fact, very soon. Other estimates based on cumulative sales figure around $1 billion, claim that as of 2004, more than 20 million people have played just D&D alone, not counting the thousands of other role-playing game systems available worldwide. The early to mid-1980s is considered the golden age years of tabletop role-playing games in the United States, Canada, and the UK. Other countries would experience their own role-playing game booms in later decades, including Europe in the later 80s, South America in the 1990s, Israel in the 2000s, etc. So again, 1980s, golden age of US, UK, 1990s, South America and Europe, and 2000, Israel and others. Since the first RPG in 1974, hundreds, if not thousands, see the indie RPG boom of most recent years, of role-playing game systems have been published, covering just about every genre and setting imaginable, though a few well-known settings are surprisingly still lacking an official RPG. Just a few of these include Dune by Frank Herbert, The Matrix movie series, and The X-Files. These have not been made into role-playing games as of now. Will they? Maybe. Also, you don't see Tennis the role-playing game and Go the role-playing game, unlike mangas that have everything.
I think there's a conspiracy against X-Files being a role-playing.
It could be. I want to believe.
No curling either.
Yeah, no. There's no curling role-playing games. Though there is a wrestling role-playing game. As
and
in
a car
WWE.
driving role-playing game.
Well,
And
Car
attacking.
Wars is
You
more.
can do races though.
Yeah, Car Wars is most ofly a war game. If you want to really look at it, Car Wars is not actually a full role-playing game.
The question, if Car Wars is not so much a role-playing game, what about BattleTech? Where does it stand?
Okay, so there you have the differentiations. You have games like BattleTech and Warhammer that originated as war games, and then they have the RPG versions. So there is a Warhammer role-playing game, and there's a BattleTech role-playing game, which are related to, but not the same as, the actual
War game.
war game. So,
The original content.
yeah, the original content. I played both for BattleTech. I prefer the role-playing game because mainly I like to just worry about my one mech and not having to worry about these mechs over there and that mech over there and all that other kind of stuff when I'm playing. Also, there is in the war games, story is not as important as in the role-playing game because we're going to meet and have a fight here, and that's all you need to do the war game. If you're doing the RPG, you may need to know why we're having this fight here. And might have to deal with other things like non-combat activities. While the war games don't usually have room for diplomacy. Usually. Role-playing games have branched out into many formats and hybrid formats since the first publication in 1974. There are other special courses going into greater detail about each format. Some of the hybrids include crossover board games, card games, computer and board game combos, and other mixes. So, Pathfinder role-playing game has a card game variant. So that's kind of a hybrid.
And name of it. Crossover. Name of the board game. However, it is still a role-playing board game, which is a hybrid, and it has a regular role-playing.
Monk
There's
is,
Talisman, but that's extremely competitive.
and strangely enough, Talisman is just coming out with a Kingdom Hearts version,
I am in
which is a role playing
role playing.
computer game.
Oh, okay.
So Talisman.
Well, they did finally come out with a cooperative version that I suggested to Hawk, and he got, where instead of the players trying to kill each other, you're cooperatively trying to gather the 5 talismans.
Right.
So, but it's still essentially it's a hybrid board. Yeah.
Kingdom Hearts is coming up with a role-playing game. I do not want to see the size of it.
Well, this is the board game crossover. It's not a Kingdom Hearts RPG where you can stat out Mickey and and cast spells like Donald Duck.
I'm thinking about just the size of the keys.
Yes. I hate to see the keychain dragging this whole thing along with you.
Yeah.
This is why in video games your gear just disappears and comes out of the ether when you need it.
Do you need to play the DS video game in order to understand the board game? I'm sorry.
Well, since it hasn't been published yet, we cannot answer that question. All right. Role-playing games have branched into many formats and hybrid formats since that first publication in 1974. Quick quiz. When was the first officially published role-playing game? Right, I've only said it 500 times so far. There are other specific courses going into greater detail about these formats. Some of the hybrids include crossover board games. I just read that. RPG industry is very volatile. Tabletop, RPG, and LARP small markets are small markets but growing. Hybrid and computer-based RPGs are multi-billion-dollar. Mid-80s, Gygax had Steve Jobs-like experience, and TS absorbed into Wizard of the Coast, then Hasbro. So, I don't know if that means anything to you, what a Steve Jobs experience is. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, was fired by Apple. Well, that's not relevant to the story, but...
Well, it's one of the reasons he was fired.
Yeah. Same thing happened to Gary Gygax. He was fired by TSR. And TSR was going bankrupt. And then Wizard of the Coast bought them. Wizard of the Coast is the people who made Magic the Gathering. And then Hasbro bought Wizard of the Coast. The people that have My Little Pony and Transformers and G.I. Joe. And I understand that there will be a miniatures line coming out for those settings coming up. Anyways.
There is a My Little Pony role-playing game.
There is a My Little Pony role-playing game. I am surprised there's not a G.I. Joe role-playing game yet. I mean, there are games that really work well with that, like Masks. Makes easy for G.I. Joe transference. But there's not an official one for those yet. There's also a Pokemon role-playing game.
Barbie's about to have a birthday. Same day as me.
Yeah, but Millicent is slightly older than you.
Oh yeah, Barbie is going to be 68 or something.
You really think the amount of plastic surgery she's gone through is healthy?
I'm not sure that one.
She's a doll. Every surgery is a plastic surgery.
Her entire face is plastic now.
It was always plastic. We're not talking the conversions of Cabbage Patch dolls from cloth figures to real figures. But back onto the course that you will be quizzed on. You will not be quizzed on whether or not Cabbage Patch dolls had cloth faces at one time. Or the fact that I was given an opportunity to buy one cheap and I turned it down and now regret it. Anyways. Despite the RPG boon and the D&D cartoon, Gary Gygax living the wild life in Hollywood with cocaine and mistresses, TSR was barely surviving financially. He implemented a lot of significant changes to save the company and succeeded, but set in motion events that would lead Gary Gygax experiencing a very quote-unquote Steve Jobs-like event, and he was forced out by the very person he hired of his own company in 1986. Steve Jobs experienced a somewhat similar event in 1985 when forced out by the board of Apple. So Gary Gygax literally hired this woman to modernize and make TSR better. And one of her ways that she felt to make TSR better was to get rid of the founder. And she did. And then she prevented him from doing any role-playing game stuff in the future, because everything he tried to create himself. She sued. In the 1970s through 1980s, there were 4 major versions of D&D with many revisions during the time. There was the original D&D, which I showed you in the box. There was basic D&D, which came out in 1977, which is now referred to as BECMI. That's Basic, Expert, Companion, Masters, and Immortals. Advanced D&D, which a lot of people refer to as first edition, was from 1977 to 1988. Then Advanced D&D second edition came out in 1989. That's when Hawk quit buying D&D books because he didn't want to rebuy everything again. Even though I would say that second edition was a lot better organized.
Well, and there is a lot of second edition on that show.
I'm talking about when it came out. In 1989, Hawk stopped buying them. He came back to buying them afterwards when he started RPG research.
Speaking of second, I just today got one of the best supplements that they ever put out. Complete book of villains. Dungeon Master supplement that goes step by step. Building villains. Whether you're doing role-playing games or doing stories, I love this book.
Yeah.
And I'm actually donating this to RPG Research Library, and I'm going to design a course with Hawk specifically on villains for high-level Game Master courses. Because if you're doing a campaign, you need good villains.
Right.
So one of the few good things about second.
There are some good things about second edition.
No, it did push some new ideas, like the whole idea of secondary skills and stuff. You know, instead of just fighting, hey, you saw this because you have history knowledge.
Right. The biggest problem with second edition was glut. There were Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, Spelljammer, Athos, Ravenloft. I could go on for a lot longer. There were so many different systems, and you didn't want, you had to choose one. So they were actually competing against themselves. Or you could try to be rich and buy everything, but that wasn't possible either. So they were competing against themselves, and that hurt. 1990s, hybrid games based on role-playing games. Interactive board games like Dark Tower. Collectible trading card games, that's CCG or TCG. Simpler rules, RPGs less profitable. It was more of a labor of love in the 1990s. CGs were big money. Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, etc. Magic the Gathering was the first collectible card game. There was a baseball game that was presented at one time, but I didn't quite make it like Magic did.
It's also the biggest, most amount of time.
Yeah, and unfortunately, all of Wizards and Hasbro's loves goes to the card games and not to the role-playing game. I mean,
Last year they showed a lot more love. Past.
I remember the real good days of the past when they really supported it with like actual products and demos and giveaways and free stuff. Yeah, none of that stuff exists anymore. Around the 1990s, hybrid games developed that were based on many concepts from role-playing games. Some used cards as a focus instead of characters, also began to shift to simpler rules. The shift to cards was completed in 1993 with the creation of Magic the Gathering, which is a collectible card game, aka tradable card game, still very popular worldwide. These CCG/TCGs are much more financially lucrative for publishers than RPGs. The industry also further diversified from just paper and dice tabletop role-playing games to now also include a wide range of hybrid collectible card games, solo computer role-playing games, massive multiplayer online role-playing games, Morgs, persistent online worlds, multi-user dungeons, MUDs, and many other variations. 2000 saw the first major D&D version changes in 10 years, with more frequent major version changes to come. There was D&D 3rd edition in 2000. I went to Gen Con and was given the first player's handbook. Not this was the first player's handbook ever, but Gen Con was was the first place it was available. Got mine signed by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and several other people. Then Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 came out, which fixed some of the flaws from 3rd edition. In 2008, the world came to an end and wasn't corrected until 5th edition. Came out in 2014. So, to clarify for you, D&D 4th edition came out in 2008. And it was basically a disaster. We'll talk more about that in a second. D&D 3.0 and 3.5 did well, especially with the advent of Open Gaming License, making it easier for third-party companies to publish materials based on the core 3.x rules. However, it also set in motion events that would later cause D&D to briefly lose its place in the #1 selling RPG. So, Pathfinder came out at the end of 3.5. Pathfinder gaming system was originally written for Dungeons and Dragons.
Golarion was supposed to be a D&D setting? The setting of Pathfinder.
Pathfinder was originally Dungeons and Dragons 3.5. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's still technically 3.5. A lot of people refer to it as 3.75. Mm-hmm. Then there's Pathfinder's 2nd edition is coming out, but it did start as a 3.5 product. It was introduced in Dragon magazine. Mm-hmm. It was really cool ideas and things like goblins that had actual personalities. It was really neat. D&D 4th edition was not well received. Poor sales, completing OGL 3.x games, especially those of Pathfinder, saw D&D fall briefly from the #1 sales spot. So at this time with 4th edition, 3.75, aka Pathfinder, became the #1 selling game for role-playing games, and D&D had dropped. A lot of people claim that it was because it was video gamed. There was a lot of reliance on cards, so they put in these cards for your different powers and stuff like that. It didn't feel like old school D&D at all, and it did not do well financially. So 2014 they came out with 5th edition, which was a revival. Sales from D&D properties were also notable. Hasbro Corporation for the first time acknowledged and discussed D&D as a valuable asset in a recent stakeholders meeting in 2017. They mentioned them a couple times. They normally didn't even mention that they owned Hasbro at these meetings. I mean, that Hasbro owned Dungeons & Dragons at those meetings. But they're starting to make significant sales. Board games and RPG market sales have experienced generous double-digit growth since 2011. After peaking in 2007, video game sales are steadily declining. 2008 to 2016 only slightly improved in 2017. Crowdsourcing services are now a significant contribution that is Kickstarter, fueling an especially diverse indie RPG movement in recent years. There are so many things that are being funded on Kickstarter for role-playing games.
I can think of two off the top of my head.
Go ahead, Sam.
That is the newest hero, City of Heroes.
Okay.
And then the Sentinels of the Multiverse. I do believe just came off Kickstarter 2 days.
Also off of Kickstarter was The Expanse, a role-playing game, which is science fiction. Really great series. More detailed history about role-playing gaming, especially in the RPG industry. See Shannon Appleklein's 4-volume set, Designers and Dragons, A History of Role-Playing Game Industry, or sign up for the History of RPG course when it becomes available.
You can ask me to grab things.
I could, but I didn't.
I'm trying to help you.
These are the Designers and Dragons books. There's 4 of them. They're fairly thick. Good references, talking all about everything you want to know about the origins of role-playing games.
It goes one for each decade, and it starts where?
Well, it starts
80s?
obviously the 70 through 79. Mm-hmm. Then the next one's 80 through 89, 90 through 99, and 2000 to 2009. So I'm wondering if they're going to come out with a new one in 2020. We'll see.
Well, technically, there's room for 2010. Oh, wait, no. My brain didn't do the
So
math.
they can't really write about this year yet.
Yeah.
A little early.
They can start it.
Sure, they can start it. There's all kinds of things to talk about and controversies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that was the RPG history, as is written. In 1960s, graffiti things like Frodo Lives in a music video by Leonard Nimoy, also known as Spock from Star Trek, on a 1967 variety television show singing The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins. That's a video that I would have showed you through my slides.
Oh, don't like it?
I love Leonard Nimoy. We should. I don't.
I'm not saying you're mean, but you're mean. It was a lot of fun.
Actually, he can at least carry a tune. William Shatner should not be allowed near a mic when there is music involved. Well, actually, William Shatner should.
You know, you're blaming a classically trained actor who was forced to do non-classical stuff.
No, I'm
Well, you can make sure that
blaming an
happens before.
egomaniac who was
Oh my
put front and center of a
goodness.
television show. Then he was put front and center in another television show, police show.
Adam 12. That's not relevant.
You didn't like Rocket Man?
Oh, let me. Yeah.
By William Shatner?
No, I haven't seen it.
Did she?
See if I can-
Every week. 4 times a week. At least.
All right, I'm going to pull up my version of the slideshow to make sure we didn't miss any notes, and I will quiz you off my slideshow.
Which we didn't get to see.
Which you didn't get to see, but I told you the information from. But before we do that, let's everybody go ahead and take a break, and then we'll go ahead and do a review. So, 5-minute break.
It's been about 45 minutes. Right?
Yep, it's 7:13 now, so if everybody can be back here in about 5 minutes. Get a drink, water.
Oh, crap.
Dan, have you ever played at John's table?
No.
No. Jane?
No, I don't like it when my characters.
Yes!
Have you?
Yeah, that's where that comes from.
Is he always like that then?
No,
No, I'm just.
he's a great DM. It's just
No.
we
put
made
it away,
a poor
put it away.
mistake
Put it away now.
with choice of
Put it away,
spider.
put it away now.
Nothing
That
should
was
be
Hawk's fault.
nothing should be allowed to do
These things
points
are-
for a D4 of exhaustion.
No, I
Oh,
I
It was
was.
inappropriate breaks.
Have you ever seen there was this horrible celebrity album on there. Nobody. It was absolutely horrible. And he did Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Mae West did Shake It Up, Baby Now. Christian Chat, yeah, that's the song. It was. It was criminal.
All right, I see you guys back. I'm gonna hit some more key notes.
So,
For
what
you.
were you concerned about with John's game?
If the quiz was going to reflect his DMing style, because I'd be intimidated.
He doesn't actually. He's a really good.
I have
we give
never
him
killed
crap.
a player.
We give him crap about killing all of our
We
characters.
generally expect people not to murder each other in real life. You understand? Right? I'm just being silly. I just
You're in the
replicate.
US now.
Stop trying to make him scared. All right.
Don't worry, I know
mean-
that Brazil's crime rate is way higher than the US. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like saying where you came from has a lower crime rate.
You don't remember where he came from, or you didn't want to say it?
I did not remember right off the top of my head because my brain's not pulling up facts right now because I had a lifting heavy things.
Say the first thing that comes to mind.
Because I know it's wrong.
I come from no.
No,
that's
you come
fine.
from Brazil. No, the other dam.
Oh.
That's the one I'm having a problem pulling up. It's just not. It's part of the U.S.
Does reggae mean anything to you?
Yes.
I'm from Jamaica,
Yes. That's what I mean.
but I also grew up in Florida.
I know, but
Which was worse.
Oh, so you're actually from Jamaica then?
Yeah, I was actually born in Jamaica.
yeah, that's what I mean.
That's cool.
I'm an immigrant.
That's okay.
Technically, you were still a
That is
U.S.
perfectly
citizen.
No, Jamaica is not a U.S. territory.
It isn't. Oh.
No,
Jamaica's its own
it was a
country.
British colony.
Oh, that's.
So technically, I was the subject of the Queen.
I was.
Which
wrong.
means he was, at one point, eligible to be knighted.
No.
But you lost that.
Oh no! My skin's too dark to be.
Hey, this is the 2000s. You never know what could happen.
Hey, there's there's
A black
know,
princess.
But yeah,
Yeah, but is she going to be knighted?
no, she would be.
That would be a
named.
demotion.
She would be named.
Yeah, people don't typically take demotions like that.
But yeah, no, I would not have had any chance to be knighted because it would have required me staying in Jamaica longer than I could have lasted.
I'll be back in a short moment. Hopefully, probably before she does.
Yeah, actually, I saw 2 copies rather cheap. Buy it now on eBay. So I also got one for my my oldest son.
I'm trying to think if I have that copy at home
Mm-hmm.
because I've got a few second edition books.
Well, this is the only one I ever saw with a blue copy. I didn't even realize they put out Dungeon Master supplements.
Yeah,
I just, the red ones, the dwarf, complete book of dwarves, complete book of fighters, all that junk. But yeah, I didn't even know that they put this out. The first one I found down in the Tri-Cities, Infinite Frontiers, I always go in there for cool, obscure comics and game stuff. And I was just flipping through and I happened to see it. I was like, what the heck is that? Pull it out. And it was like, you just, from the very first page, you just start running. How to build a villain. What is a villain? How do you build it? Very step by step. And I mean, this I also like because, also being a writer and a storyteller, you could use this. It just all the things that you would, the things that separate, there's bad guys, and then there's recurring villains that keep coming back and keep giving you crap. And like in the case of Darth Vader, at first you think he's a bad guy, and then Empire Strikes Back. Oh, there's the Emperor actually above him, and he's not even the head villain, and all these different things. And it's a great. If you don't have it, you should get it because when I say I found it for cheap, I got this one and the other one for about $20. They originally came out; they were $18, and they're getting harder and harder to find because people realize, what a great tool it is, regardless of the game you're playing. They're a great
It's system agnostic.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. What's that?
System agnostic.
Yeah,
It really doesn't care what system you're. I mean, the device is good no matter what system.
Yeah.
Or even what setting. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
a villain's a villain.
Yeah.
Yeah. and
My secret for villains is villains don't believe they're evil.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the cool thing in here. It even sets up examples of a villain for each alignment.
Yeah.
Even a lawful good villain. Which, I mean,
it depends on your interpretation of the law.
well, and even, people doing, they think they're doing the right thing, even, if they think, what they're, why they're doing it is right, they're still doing horrible things. I mean, in this country, we used to think that, making Native Americans, get rid of the clothes they wear and not speak their language that they grew up with, this is a good thing that we're doing for them. So, you may think you're good, but when you get down to it.
But is alignment about about something internal, or is alignment, because I always figured that alignment was a more metaphysical stuff that Okay, in this setting, there is a good faction, an evil faction. Where do you fall between these? Or is that not how alignment works?
I mean, it's mainly a matter
Depends
of.
on the environment, honestly.
And
The setting.
I think it's kind of a thing where, at least as long as you're not, insane or something, a lawful good person would never torture someone, for instance. Because not only do you follow the laws, but you do it in such a way that you try and follow the laws in a benevolent way. Now, a lawful evil person would look at the same situation, and they're more concerned about the good of the country, so they have no problems torturing somebody because to them the nation is more important than an individual's rights. So they're still following the laws, they're just doing it in a very unscrupulous, amoral way.
And another good way to look at it is girls' interaction. So a lawful good person might still make fun of someone or point out their flaws and think that they're doing nothing wrong.
Yeah, so
I love my sex.
I mean, some of it, you have to kind of
Girls
look at
do
the
that a lot.
context of society and stuff. But as far as gameplay, lawful, like especially everybody is frustrated to have paladins around because they don't let you do anything. Which, as you get into the gamers, there's a bit of that in there.
Yeah.
Also, lawful good people, they're very concerned about the welfare of others and society in general.
Yeah.
And so
I tried earlier. I failed.
Okay, that's a good picture of the monitor. A little higher.
you need to come up that way.
A little bit higher. No, right there. That's fine. That's good.
Yeah.
All right, now let's go back to class.
Yeah.
We discussions on alignments and the basics. Very interesting stuff. We can talk about that forever. So there are 5 types of role-playing games, known as formats. So what are the 5 major role-playing game formats? Does anybody name any of them? Just name one.
Tabletop?
Tabletop role-playing games, or RPG, only one T. A lot of people like to do 2 T's in tabletop, but if you separate them into 2 words to tabletop, then that means it's the top of the table, not something on the table. Anyways, so that's one. You can give me another one.
Solo books and adventure modules.
Solo Adventures, Books and Modules, SABM. Solo Adventures, Book and Modules, of course, for those who haven't seen it, are the Choose Your Own Adventure type books. There is the Choose Your Own Adventure brand books, but there is also other ones by, let's see, his name is Steve Jackson and many other people. There's Romeo and Juliet. Choose Your Own Adventure books. There are there are various degrees of Choose Your Own Adventures, and we can get into the pros and cons of each of those in a moment, because when I'm going through my slideshow, I'm going to get into a lot more detail of the various different types, and we'll talk about those things. So we have 2 of them. Give me a third one.
Well, we mentioned hybrids before.
Okay, hybrid role-playing games. That's a combination of different styles. Now, it could be a combination, can be a board game role-playing game, which we see a lot more of nowadays, but it can also be a role-playing game with an electronic component. Some of those have happened before.
I got the other 2.
Okay.
We have a live-action role-playing game.
Okay.
And then we just changed it from computer-based role-playing games to electronic role.
Right. So computer-based role-playing games, CRGs, is a subset of ERPG, electronic role-playing games. I'm going to have to do this quickly because my power's dying. No, by the time it got to you, it would be dead. So
do you need a regular plugin?
Yeah, just a note, regular.
I got you.
But moving on, There are electronic role-playing games that were not digital. They were like on cassette tapes. So you can fast forward and rewind to the different timestamps.
A good solo computer, or you can have SABMs that are solo, such as a mail or email play.
Right. That's a play-by-mail is a method of playing games.
Mm-hmm.
So most of these are very linear. They literally just branch out like this, as is seen in the illustration. Go ahead and hold this up to the screen. And they're very simple. You don't have an actual character sheet or anything.
Well, and if you caught our opening and first play of, I forget which one we were playing. The newer one.
The Cthulhu one?
The Cthulhu one, yes. We had.
That's a solo adventure book and module.
Yes. The beginning was.
Right.
And it did a circle, so it had tiers, but then you could come back to.
Oh, that's good.
This is Steve Jackson's Sorcery. It actually had a character sheet. I don't know if I can find the character sheet right here, but it had dice in here, so you can roll for random things. I need to find roll my dice to see if I succeed on something. I just go to a random page, and I rolled a 7. 5 and 2. You also had to memorize your spells. You had hit points and character sheets. So you get it says, which spell do you try? And you got a 3-letter code. And you had to remember which spell it was and go to the right page. You were not supposed to use your spell book once you started playing the adventure. You were supposed to literally memorize your spells.
Huh.
So this is a more advanced version. There are modules that have basically completely choose your own adventures. You can highlight them with a reveal marker, which unfortunately is only a one-time use thing. Then later they came out with these ones where you put a red lens over it so you can read the maps and the little encoded things. So those are some more of the interesting information for the SABMs. Now let's go to my slideshow.
That is working.
Yes, it's powered up. I can actually, if you see the screen again.
Yay! Sometimes that cord doesn't work.
It's going to take me a moment to skip through a lot of this stuff that's on the slideshow because it was set up for a professional thing. So it's going to talk a lot about populations, at-risk use, death, toddlers, that kind of stuff. Term summaries, RPG, role-playing game, those kind of things that we weren't going into here. Hey, Coral, overview. Raise your hand when prompted. In form of video games. All right, role-playing game was the first thing you think of. Depending on how old you are, you may think of video games, LARPs, with bothing with foam weapons, or the original Dungeons & Dragons games. The older people think of the older styles. The younger people think of the computer games. Video clips. Go science fiction, fantasy genres, notables Edgar Allan Poe. So name me some notable people other than Edgar Allan Poe that were influences on Dungeons and Dragons. Okay.
H.G. Wells.
Okay. And what else is H.G. Wells known for?
Little Wars.
Little Wars. Very good. Can you name a person?
You've already said.
Edgar and Edgar. Edgar Allan Poe and Edgar Rice Burroughs. And H.G. Wells.
Well, there's also Tolkien, but he's a little bit later on.
Well, he was definitely an influence on Dungeons and Dragons, yes.
Yeah.
J.R.R. Tolkien, 1937 was what?
1937 was Little Wars.
The Hobbit.
Oh, The Hobbit. Oh.
When was Little Wars?
1917?
13.
13.
13.
That in my notes.
1968, Chainmail. what was chainmail?
Chainmail was a war game, a medieval war game with some fantasy elements stacked on the end. Just
Correct.
content. For the fantasy stuff, of course.
When was actual Dungeons and Dragons invented?
1975.
And who are the authors?
Gary Gygax.
No. Jeff Perrin was Chainmail.
Oh, sorry. That would have been Dave Arneson.
Dave Arneson. When was the golden age of role-playing games for South America?
1990s.
1990s. How about for Israel?
A little bit later.
Yeah, it was later, 2000. All right. And the UK and the US, of course, was
When I first started playing.
1980s. And that was also the height of the Satanic Panic, which we're not getting into a lot of history on here. So we'll see if we can hit some of those points here. 1980s estimated how many people were playing D&D?
Million?
How many million?
2 to 5 million, but that was only based on.
Actually, it was 2 to 5% of the U.S. population. It was 20 to 30 million.
Oh, okay.
And until 1980s, it was shown as just a game, as illustrated in Steven Spielberg's 1982 movie E.T. They were playing Dungeons and Dragons during the E.T. movie. One of the insults one kid was throwing at another one was saying that he had zero charisma. But there was no connotation of this is weird, this is abnormal, this is just a game that people were playing.
That was actually right before the Satanic Panic, really.
Just before.
I remember so many comic books had ads. It's sitting around the table playing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden.
So things we haven't covered in the other thing was the moral panic, aka Satanic Panic, which includes claims against music, movies, television, video games, and Dungeons and Dragons. Geraldo Rivera primetime expose, Devil Worship Exposing Satan's Underground, broadcasted on NBC. It was the most watched 2-hour TV documentary in history. It was in 1988, and it was saying that Dungeons and Dragons was satanic.
And he still gets on periodically. I think it's like once every 2 years.
Wrong person.
Wrong person?
You're talking the 700 Club.
Yep.
With Pat Robertson.
Yeah. I wish it was only every couple of years that
It's yearly.
Rivera came on. He's still.
No, I mean to directly attack the role playing game industry.
The effects of this time still have an impact today. Important to know when considering RPGs for program playing.
Pat Robertson thinks he's going to be insane.
Something like that. So, interactive board game, hybrid, Dark Tower.
Oh, that was so much fun.
What's a CCG?
Collectible card game.
Okay.
Otherwise known as a Magic the Gathering clone.
I wouldn't call any of them clone.
I mean,
you really like the new one, and it's not.
Oh
very,
no! I just say that because I mean, basically, Magic it was kind of, I think as far as just games in general, I think it was kind of like one of a huge revolution. I mean, first of all, considering how popular video games were when it came out, and for it to have exploded the way it did.
Am I in trouble again?
Hybrids.
But
Hybrids.
Dungeon.
but with that,
I want to play.
I think mechanically there are some things that Magic the Gathering
There's a Disney version
kind
that's
of
coming out.
sort of made it kind of exclusionary now. It's hard for people to get into it now. That's one of the reasons why I like Keyforge, because you don't need to spend $1 million to play.
A few clarifications. The Geraldo Rivera is an example of the general Satanic Panic. It wasn't specific to role-playing games. But just the fact that it was the most watched television show up to that point for that type of show shows how fully blown by the late 80s this whole satanic moral panic was.
Yeah.
So that's the general. It didn't really, that particular piece didn't hammer on D&D specifically, but it was all part of that attack. It all fed into it. There was a brief mentioning of role-playing in it, but it was mostly just all about devil worship and everything
And
else,
rock and roll.
which was all heavily disproven.
Yeah.
That particular expose was heavily disproven. It was just pure hype. It was, so TSR said there were 2 to 3 million D&D players alone when they did a thing in the early to mid 80s. Very early 80s, I think it was 2 to 3 million.
You have your 20 to 30 million.
Right, well, so here's the thing. That was just D&D. By then, there were a ton of other role-playing games out there. And it was estimated, but it's hard to prove, that 20 to 30 million role-playing gamers worldwide. But just D&D alone was 2 to 3 million. And there were scores of other role-playing games that were very popular and were taking up a lot of market share and such. MERP almost caught up to D&D at one point in the 80s in popularity. Like, it was really close. Like Pathfinder.
MERP is
like,
Middle-earth role-playing game.
Like Pathfinder beat 4th edition D&D for a little while. MERP was starting to do that right around the 2nd edition time period and such. So there was kind of a slump there when 2nd edition came out. And I was part of that cause myself, right there. I wasn't the only person who did it, apparently. But yeah, 20 to 30 million is estimated, but nobody really has any hard numbers. But that's a very conservative estimate for that time period, just extrapolating from all the different sources.
Right.
But if you want to be really safe, only hard numbers are what TSR published of 2 to 3 million, just for D&D alone, and that was when the U.S. population was significantly less than it is now.
And at that time, TSR had more than just Dungeons and Dragons for role-playing games. Star
Yeah.
Frontiers, Boot Hill.
Yep. Although those didn't sell as well as some of the competing products out there.
Well, they also didn't they have the rights to the first Marvel role-playing game?
Yeah, the yellow box right over there.
Yep. Good times.
There was another tidbit. I was posting in Discord.
Which I can't see.
I was saying, after you get through this, if you still have time, you could start doing the Gamers 2 Darkness Rising analysis review.
Right. I'm going through the original slideshow
That's
and finding
fine.
the things that
There's
weren't
a
mentioned.
few little glitches in that particular version, so
Right.
yeah.
Where
But yeah, you could do the Gamers 2, because everybody's seen Gamers 2 now, right? Everybody's watched it through once for entertainment. Shane,
Yes.
you've watched Gamers 2 all the way through for entertainment?
I've watched all the gamer videos. Yeah.
Good. Hey, Danielle, of course you have.
oh yeah.
So then, so if you get through that and you still have time, you could start going through the analysis version.
Okay.
Just watch it on the web on the big screen. Oh wait, you can't.
Can't watch anything on the big screen.
If we hook this up to this one, we can do it.
Yeah.
right?
Okay, I'll do that. While you anyway, continue. Sorry.
All right.
That because that's an older presentation that has a few glitches in it. So sorry.
Minis, what happened to Gary Gygax?
Pushed out
He
to
was
by TSR.
removed.
He was fired.
And within 1 year, what happened to another big CEO of the same thing around about within 1 year of
Jobs.
that? Yeah.
He got what
Lost
he
his job.
deserved.
He was put on. He was put on indefinite leave.
Well, there's
So-
some reason Bill Gates saved it, but
Board games and RPG market sales were doing what since 2011?
Increasing.
Uh,
And what were video games doing?
Fine.
Decreasing.
Right.
And then that decline continued until about 2017. It's changed this way. Started.
They're getting better stuff out.
No.
You don't think
People
they're...
have already had much.
Oh,
The quality hasn't really improved. Just people.
Well,
I don't
and the
play video games very
are-
much anymore.
Games are coming out for less. Certain games on certain consoles are coming out for less of a.
I don't think that's.
Well, that would add to the economic, wouldn't it?
If they were really that revolutionary, but I don't think they have. I think it's purely just people have to spend again.
there's a nice video collage from 700 Club, 60 Minutes, 1985, CBS, 1985, CBC, sorry, not CBS, CBC, which is Canadian Broadcasting Channel. Uber Goober was Get a Life, Texas 2004. Lots of references. So here are the statements from RPG Controversies that you probably have heard some of these. D&D/RPGs will make you commit suicide, make you commit murder, make you more violent. You have no meaning in your life. This will lead to the cult and devil worship, because they thought that those books had actual spells you could cast and do something with. It will lead you away from, insert your religious system here. It's only for people with no social skills and will make you antisocial, to use the layman's use of that term, not the actual psychological use of antisocial. D&D players are dorks, nerds, geeks, and losers that can't succeed in real life and live in their mother's basement.
Well, we're in a garage, so that's wrong.
What?
We were
And
in
Hawk
the
is not our
basement.
mother.
Yeah, he's not our mom.
And we don't live in the garage.
That and the stigma of the term dork has changed.
Has it?
Well, especially when people found out what the word dork means. Gamers are all male, and there aren't any female role-playing gamers. I am sorry, you don't exist.
I don't exist. Neither does Dan.
Well, for this,
Wait a minute, you are male, right?
I am male, but for this, I can also,
He's male, but he's not pale.
not pale enough. But I do have some British in me, so I guess they're counting that.
Must be.
You're white for standard, but
Oh, we lost our camera again.
Which camera?
Middle.
There's nothing we can do about it. We'd have to stop and start.
Last time we jiggled things.
It won't come back. Keep going.
All right. I expect you to be able to answer this question off the top of your head. What is BADD, bad?
bothered against Dungeons and Dragons.
About? Who is responsible for bad?
PP? That help me one?
I'm horrible with names, but I know that it's a mother who claims that Dungeons and Dragons caused her son to commit.
Right. And her name is?
Patricia Poling.
Chipoling.
Pause for a second.
Okay.
So this.